Well, good evening. I used to be a secondary school maths teacher until quite recently. And so I've got great sympathy for the biology teacher who asked his students to name a bird with wings that couldn't fly. A dead bird, sir. Very good. I think I would have laughed politely and then just sent them out. But anyway, see, the answer there to that question was correct, wasn't it? It was a correct answer. But it's also just about as close as we want to get to joking about death, isn't it? You see, death, it's not a subject that any of us really want to dwell on. And so for most of our existence, we just don't think about it. Is there any life after death? It's normally a question that you leave to children who hope to see their granny or their dog, either will do, again in heaven. Maybe to the politics, philosophy, or economics student who just couldn't think of anything better to study. To the middle-aged, midlife crisis sufferer who just wants to know the point of everything. Or to the elderly cancer patient who's in the process of sorting out their funeral costs and arrangements. Try not to think about it, and it might go away. But it doesn't, does it? Time ticks steadily on. You just have to look at the plaques on the walls of this building. The people that are written on there, they used to be sitting in here as well, full of life, full of hope. But now there's nobody at all who remembers their names, except for the occasional very bored churchgoer in the middle of a sermon who's got very good eyesight. There's a photo on my wall at home of two of my daughters, and this is when they were aged 2 and 3. Now, they're only 5 and 6 years old now, but already, every time I look at that photo, I'm aware of time just ticking steadily by. Time that I'm never going to get back. Time that just keeps going tick, 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 until one day, well, that's it, isn't it? Time's up. Is there life after death? Well, often Christians feel very much on the back foot when people raise questions about their faith. There are many times we feel like we're defending with our backs against the wall. But on this question, the Christian is in a unique position. A Christian can answer this question with a level of certainty that no other person in the world can come up with. You see, the evidence that is available is all on the Christian's side. The question shouldn't be, you actually believe in life after death, but rather, why do you not believe in life after death? Well, let's start with the honest answer that those who are most skeptical about Christianity give, and let's pick the best and the most respected atheists to give that answer. Here is Sam Harris. We're going to watch a Sam Harris video in a second, and this guy, he's respected for the clarity and the force of the arguments he gives for atheism. And here he is on this subject.
Well, I do have existential worries. I mean, I think everybody else, am concerned about death. Death is in some ways unacceptable. I mean, it's just an astonishing fact of our being here that we die. But I think worse than that is that if we live long enough, we lose everyone we love in this world. I mean, people die and disappear, and we are left with this stark mystery. There's just the sheer not knowing of what happened to them, and into this void, religion comes rushing with a very consoling story saying nothing happened to them, they're in a better place, and you're going to meet up with them after you die. You're going to get everything you want after you die. Death is an illusion. There's no question that if you could believe it, that would pay emotional dividends. I mean, there's no other story you can tell somebody who's just lost her daughter to cancer, say, to make her feel good. It is consoling to believe that the daughter was just taken up with Jesus and everyone's going to be reunited in a few short years. There's no replacement for that. There doesn't need to be a replacement for that. I think we have to just witness the cost of that. I mean, there are many obvious costs of that way of thinking. One is we just don't teach people how to grieve. Religion is the kind of the antithesis of teaching your children how to grieve. You tell your child that grandma's in heaven, and there's nothing to be sad about. That's religion. It would be better to equip your child for the reality of this life, which is, death is a fact, and we don't know what happens after death. And I'm not pretending to know that you get a dial tone after death. I don't know what happens after the physical brain dies. I don't know what the relationship between consciousness and the physical world is. I don't think anyone does know. Now, I think there are many reasons to be doubtful of naive conceptions about the soul and about this idea that you could just migrate to a better place after death. But I simply don't know about I don't know what I believe about death. And I don't think it's necessary to know in order to live as sanely and ethically and happily as possible. I don't think you don't get anything worth getting by pretending to know things you don't know.
One of the things that you might want to think about more later is that idea of whether a belief in the afterlife means we don't grieve properly. But just let go of that one for the time being and focus on the key issue that we're dealing with here. Sam Harris, he's really honest when he says he just doesn't know what happens after death. Do we get a dial tone? Is there some way we continue to live? I just don't know is the right answer from his view of the world, because he's got no empirical evidence at all to bring to the table. I didn't realize how many times he said "I don't know" until I had to type that out on that slide. He really doesn't know. Well, Christopher Hitchens, another one of these really respected atheists, before he died, and as he was suffering from cancer, he gave an extended interview to the BBC's Jeremy Paxman. And whatever your thoughts on Christopher Hitchens, it's an interesting video to watch. It's about half an hour long. And in that interview, he critiques a thing called Pascal's wager, which we're going to look at shortly. But in doing that, he gives this very honest comment in response to Paxman pushing him about the comfort of having some sort of belief in that death is not the end. I don't know that there is no such thing as consciousness without the brain, for example, that there is no such survival. I very much doubt it, but let's say we don't know enough to say that is impossible. I would say that what is impossible is that other humans can know what the conditions are whereby you qualify for survival. That I do know is false. He went on to say, if I find I am alive in any way at all, I shall be surprised. Well, like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens had to admit that, he just didn't know. What he did know for certain was that nobody else could know either. He very much doubted it, but he could end up being surprised. So far, all I want us to see is that although we may feel there should be life after death, maybe to see loved ones again or to see justice finally done, or because it brings some sort of significance, or maybe we feel that there can't be life after death, maybe because of our particular worldview or commitment to atheism or whatever. Whatever we feel, there just isn't simply anybody who knows. The honest answer of the most intelligent humans is simply, I don't know. Now, if that's the best that any of us can do, then how are we to act? Should we gamble on there being a God? Limit how we live now in the hope of getting a better life after death? Maybe we should gamble on there not being a God. Live whatever way we want now, but risk a very bad life after death. Well, that was the argument for religious faith put forward by Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, and the argument that came to be known as Pascal's wager. And you can see on the screen what it involves. The stakes are a bit higher than the £5 accumulators that my football-mad friends put on every Saturday and then get really angry with them. But you see here, since we can't prove God's existence, and therefore we can't prove whether there's life after death, we've got a choice to make. So if we choose to believe in God on his terms, and it ends up that he does exist, then we get eternity in heaven. If he doesn't exist, well, we haven't really lost anything, have we? If we choose not to believe in God, and he ends up that he does exist, then we have eternity in hell. And if he doesn't exist, well, we haven't really lost anything again, have we? So the sensible decision, according to Pascal, the mathematician, is to put your chips on God existing. After all, that's the only gamble that might pay off. Well, Christopher Hitchens hated this argument, as it involves, in his words, a very cynical God and a rather stupid one who will say, I noticed you made a profession of faith just there, and also because I am God, I know why you did it, in the hope of gaining favor with me. Well, that's fine. You will therefore get it. Hitchens said that reasoning like that was pretty low, quite contemptible. And I would hazard a guess that lots of us who are here would probably agree with him on that. Although, in truth, Pascal's wager is a bit more sophisticated than what Hitchens understood it as. The great news for humanity, though, is that Pascal's wager is just not the best that we can do. A great theologian by the name of Scott Mackay, actually just that bloke that was standing here a few minutes ago, the guy that looks a bit like Mr. Bean, he has adapted Pascal's wager to give us a much more rigorous approach to answering the question of life after death. You see, something happened at a particular moment in history that still leaves us with a choice to make. But the choice is no longer an uninformed gamble. Around 2,000 years ago, a world-changing claim was made that Jesus Christ actually, physically, rose from the dead. And so in Scott's version of Pascal's wager, the question we have to answer is whether or not this actually happened. If you choose to accept that God raised Jesus from the dead, and that turns out to be true, then you'll be raised also. But if it turns out not to be true, well, then you've wasted your life, you've wasted your time, you've wasted your money, you've wasted your life. If you choose to reject that Jesus was raised from the dead, and it turns out that he wasn't, then you've lived your life just how you would want to, on your terms right now. But if you choose to reject that Jesus was raised to life, and it turns out he was, well, then you've wasted your life and your soul both now and for eternity. Mark Lanier, currently recognized as one of the best lawyers in the States, in examining the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus under current courtroom standards in America, he says this: is the burden of proof more likely than not, as in a civil case, or is it beyond a reasonable doubt, as in a criminal case? Under either burden, the evidence for a resurrected Jesus is immensely compelling. So, while the brightest and the most argumentative of people have to admit that they just don't know the answer, if it were true that Jesus Christ did indeed die and then live again, if that is true, then we have someone worth listening to on the subject. So what is the evidence that Mark Lanier and many others like him find just so compelling? And the sheet that is on your table might help you to keep referring back as we go through this. So firstly, the empty tomb. The earliest Jewish arguments admit the empty tomb, and they focus instead on arguing that the body of Jesus must have been stolen. Dr. Paul Mayer calls this positive evidence from a hostile source. In essence, if a source admits a fact that is decidedly not in its favor, then that fact is genuine. The Jews were hostile witnesses when it comes to Jesus Christ, and yet they saw no value in arguing against the emptiness of the tomb. Jesus' resurrection was preached in the same city where he was killed and buried. And theologian Paul Althus writes that the resurrection account could not have been maintained for a single day, a single hour, if the emptiness of the tomb had not been established as a fact for all concerned. It would have been such a simple thing for the Jewish authorities or the Roman authorities to just put an end to Christianity by going to the tomb and pointing to the rotting corpse. And then when you compare Mark's, in Mark's Gospel, when you compare that, a simple account of the days around the crucifixion and the resurrection, and with a later forgery called the Gospel of Peter, you can see the contrast between an account that has a ring of truth about it and one that is just simply mythical. In the later Gospel of Peter, you get a whole crowd of people watching the resurrection take place. 3 people come out of the tomb with their heads touching the sky, followed by a talking cross. You see, in Mark, you only get what could simply be seen. Imagine that in the January of 2017, one of your art-hating, culture-despising friends had grumpily told you that overnight a huge propeller had been installed in Hull city centre. It doesn't do anything, it's just a propeller. Would you believe it to be true? It's a hostile witness telling you a simple story about something you could just check out by jumping on a bus. Of course you would. Then we have the witnesses to the risen Jesus. The list of eyewitnesses claiming to have seen Jesus alive again over the 40 days following the empty tomb, it makes for a compelling case on its own. Mary Magdalene, a whole group of women, 2 people at a village near Jerusalem, Simon Peter, and then the rest of the disciples on numerous occasions, Jesus' brother James, and then over 500 people at once in Jerusalem, not including Paul, who's claimed to have seen the risen Jesus Christ transformed him from a fierce opponent into the most bold of believers. But because we're such advanced people, we're tempted to look back on those witnesses and just explain away what they claim to have seen. We reckon that in those days of pre-scientific method, people were just fertile soil for believing that sort of stuff. And so they could easily have imagined it because they so wanted it to be true. But this is not so. There were 2 main beliefs about resurrection at the time. Many of the Jewish people did believe that one day there would be a bodily resurrection of all God's righteous people. But this was going to happen at the same time as the fulfillment of all the other promises that they were waiting for. The idea of just an individual resurrection to a Jew was simply impossible. And the Gentile belief, that's all the other people, their belief at the time was that the soul was a good thing, but the body was a bad thing. So the idea of the freed soul being reunited with the body was both unthinkable and hugely undesirable. You see, nobody, Jew or Gentile, was expecting or hoping for Jesus to rise from the dead and to appear to them. The soil then, maybe for different reasons, but the soil then was no more fertile than the soil now. And yet these witnesses, under the fiercest pressure from both the Jewish and the Roman authorities, they refused to change their accounts. Many suffered serious consequences as a result. The details, the ring of truth, okay, that sound of truth to an account is very important. And there's a method commonly used today to determine the historicity of an event, and it's called inference to the best explanation. William Lane Craig describes this as an approach where we begin with the evidence available to us and then infer what would, if true, provide the best explanation of that evidence. Some of the details that are so easy to miss in the gospel accounts are very effective in strengthening the case because they add together to give a story that was completely unacceptable to anyone who heard it unless it was true. So the resurrection account gains credibility from the fact that the first people to see Jesus alive were women. Now, there's a big push at the minute for equal pay between men and women, and I think many of those pushing for it would have had a heart attack if they had to spend any time alive 2,000 years ago in the Middle East. Women had a very low status. They couldn't even testify in court. And yet, the gospel writers leave these women in their accounts rather than airbrushing them out and replacing them with respectable men. Why? There are variations in the gospel accounts and difficulty in arranging them all into some sort of chronological order. Yet it would have been a simple thing to ensure that all the accounts matched exactly if these stories were simple fabrications. Why don't they fit seamlessly together? Why do we need to know who took Jesus' body down for burial? And why mention a prominent member of society in Joseph Arimathea? Why just not make it an untraceable nobody? Well, the answer to each of these whys is that the writers were aiming at what was the truth rather than a believable, acceptable story. And you know, if the police are interviewing 5 witnesses after a car crash, the fact that they all noticed slightly different things or saw things slightly differently, it doesn't change the fact that there are several cars still smashed together in the middle of the road. And in fact, it would be far more suspicious if all 5 witnesses gave the exact same account. The insurance companies would soon be investigating. You see, these details matter hugely because the resurrection account had to stand up to huge scrutiny if it was going to have any sort of impact on those who heard it. And what an impact it had. Professor F.F. Bruce said that if Jesus had not risen from the dead, we should probably never have heard of him. How is it that we have heard of him? Well, transformed people. The resurrection transformed a small group of terrified disciples hiding in fear of their lives into the most dynamic movement in the history of mankind. Professor J.N.D. Anderson believes that this is by far and away the strongest circumstantial evidence for the resurrection. Soon after they started publicly testifying to Jesus' resurrection, they were 3,000 strong. Then they were 5,000 strong. They were strong enough to face the fiercest and bloodiest persecution under Nero, who blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64. Strong enough to face his lions, strong enough to face his burnings, strong enough to face his crucifixions, and to still continue to grow. Robert Linder, a modern historian, he gives this summary. He says, "Only this resurrection faith explains how the small, motley, demoralized group which Jesus left on earth after his reported ascension could have developed the enthusiasm to sweep all obstacles before them in their bold worldwide mission. Only the resurrection can explain it." And then transformed practices. Well, imagine you're talking to your lifelong Hull FC supporting friend, and he takes his jumper off to reveal a Hull KR rugby top. You would almost fall off your chair. I understand this more than I did 14 years ago when I came to Hull. What on earth has happened to get you wearing that? You would know instinctively that it was something pretty big, wouldn't you? How can we explain the dramatic adoption of a set of beliefs and practices by the earliest converts to Christianity that were so much in conflict with the established traditions of the day? Long amounts of time are normally needed for these sorts of developments. But suddenly the first Christians, who were almost all devout Jews, they were meeting on a Sunday rather than a Saturday. They were leaving circumcision behind. They were being baptized into the name of Jesus Christ. They were celebrating the Lord's Supper rather than the Passover feast. And they were worshipping a human being as if he was divine, seemingly in conflict with the most important tenets of their monotheistic faith. It's a much huger change than changing rugby tops or giving up smoking or quitting the alcohol. You see, none of this makes any sense without a genuine historical resurrection. And then a transformed present. There are over 2 billion people in the world today who would call themselves Christians, okay? And Rodney Stark, he's an American agnostic sociologist. He wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. It's a much longer title than that, but anyway, The Rise of Christianity. And he tried to explain how the Christian faith got so big so quickly. And one of his key explanations is that during two huge plague epidemics across the Roman Empire, while others fled, the Christians stayed in the cities to care for the sick. From the beginning, you see, the Christian church had resurrection written all over it. That hope of eternal life, which springs from the reality of the resurrection, sees the church continue to grow today, despite the growing secularism in the West, and despite some of the continued terrible persecution of Christians across the rest of the world. So the empty tomb that could have been checked out, the many witnesses whose whole worldview was not conducive to believing, the inconvenient details, and the world-changing impact, they all testify to the real bodily resurrection of Jesus. But hang on. As you're listening to this, I'm sure at least some of you are thinking something to this nature. He's basing most of his argument on the fact that I will accept the reliability of the gospel accounts. But the gospels weren't written until 40, 50, even 60 or 70 years after the event. And if that's you, then I guess firstly I'd encourage you to come back next time, not next week, 2 weeks' time. Come back next time when we're going to be looking at that question, why trust the Bible? But also, I would like you to apply the same standards to this part of history than to any other. So if a veteran of World War II was to walk up to the front of this room now and tell us about some of the events he witnessed in 1944, would any of us rush to call him a liar? Would we rush to doubt the accuracy of his statement? Well, no, we wouldn't. That's not saying he might not be lying, and it's not saying that he might not have got things jumbled up a little bit, but we'd be very hesitant to suggest this simply because he was there. Sure, it might be 74 years later, but he was there at the time. And if we had several others who were also there at the time telling us the same accounts, then we'd be even more hesitant to doubt the accuracy and the truthfulness of what we just heard. Well, what if a 50-year-old professor was to come to the front and publicize the book he had written about World War II? Would we simply laugh him out of the building because he wasn't even alive when it happened? Well, certainly not. If he had done his research carefully, and if they fitted in well with the eyewitness accounts of the time, then we would be extremely hesitant to disbelieve his account. You see, the argument that because the Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, how that somehow makes them unreliable or ignorable is actually quite a poor argument indeed. And in fact, when you consider that the historical accounts that we accept as accurate of Alexander the Great were written 350 to 450 years after his death, then 40 to 70 years doesn't suddenly seem like a great barrier. However, we can go much further than that. Because rather than the reliability of the gospel accounts giving you confidence that the resurrection happened, if we can show that the physical resurrection of Jesus is true, then this incredible event can easily bear the weight of credibility for the rest of the Christian message. And for this, we can come to a man called Dr. Gary Habermas. This is a guy who spent decades studying, debating, and writing on the resurrection. And as he argues for the historicity of the resurrection, he will only use facts that are accepted by critical scholars of the New Testament. It's not that all the other data isn't relevant and isn't reliable, but rather, if you can establish the resurrection of Jesus from only data that even Christianity's opponents will allow without argument, then the case is extremely strong. And so on the screen is the minimum data that serious scholars will accept. So they'll accept that Jesus died by crucifixion. and that Jesus' disciples had real experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. They'll accept that these disciples were transformed to the point of being willing to die for this message. And they'll accept that the message was proclaimed at a very early date. And on that one of the most respected and one of the most skeptical of New Testament scholars, a guy called Bart Ehrman, he acknowledges that Paul's letters, and in particular a bit in 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1 and 2, he says that that actually gets us back to within 1 or 2 years of the cross. Remember Alexander the Great in 350 to 450 years. The proximity of this teaching, it doesn't leave any room for myth. And then the critical scholars will accept that Paul had a real experience that he thought was the risen Jesus. And then James, Jesus' brother, who wasn't a believer, until he had this experience, he had a real experience that he thought too was an experience of the risen Jesus. What are we to make of this data? What are we to infer from it? Remember that this is data that agnostic and atheistic scholars will accept and even defend. Well, Timothy Keller, an American pastor and writer, he gives this summary. He says, nothing in history can be proven the way we prove something in a laboratory. However, the resurrection of Jesus is a historical fact much more fully attested to than most other events of ancient history we take for granted. So if you could coldly look at this data without the presupposition that there is no God, then you too would come to the logical conclusion that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and then rose from the dead. So where have we come to? Is there life after death? Well, the leading intellects, the leading atheists, don't have any answer to give us. They just don't know. All they know is that nobody else can know either. But what I've tried to establish throughout this argument is that we can know for certain. What we need is for someone who has been to the other side of death to tell us what is there. And the evidence that Jesus Christ died, was buried, and is alive again in a real physical body is indeed, as Mark Lanier said, compelling. It's not a myth. And so we must come to the one person who can answer our question. We must ask Jesus Christ, is there life after death? How would he answer? Well, he would tell you that death is not the end of a person, but that by itself is neither good news or bad news. Here's what he did say. Whoever hears my words and believes him who sent me has eternal life. He does not come into judgment, but has passed from death to life. Now, those words of Jesus are both good news and bad news, and let's start with the bad news. There is a day of judgment coming that every single human being will face after they die. Those people who refuse to believe Jesus, who fail to put their hope in him, to acknowledge his right to be king, are counted amongst his enemies. And this is what Jesus taught he would say to them on that final day. Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. So if you ask Jesus whether there was life after death, he might start off by warning you about the reality of hell, to avoid death after death. But the good news is there too. Those who have believed his words have already passed from death to life. So when you question Jesus about life after death, he would tell you that when you believe what Jesus says about himself and you, about your sin and his payment on the cross, about your desperate need and his great provision, then yes, you will have real physical and spiritual life when God makes all things new again. But even better, you will start at that moment to experience real life before death. Life after death. If only someone would come back to tell us. I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. Thank you.